Hello, today we'll be having a look at Dobson's The Conversation. The poem was published in 1955 and it was a part of the Child with a Cockatoo collection. Themes that link to the human experience that you may want to consider are relationships, nature, wisdom, and communication. But remember that this list is not exhaustive and it just serves as a starting point in guiding your understanding of the poem. Now, as per usual, please have a read of the poem on your own if you haven't done so already, and we'll unpack the key techniques together after we come back. Now, firstly, do make note of the fact that the poem involves two characters, so I've written that here for you. We have two characters, we have a young persona and an old man. Something interesting here is the ironic nature of the title, in which there is no actual conversation. So, like, the title is the conversation, but there's no actual conversation that is taking place between the two characters of the young persona and the old man. Rather, they are just communicating through gestures. We'll unpack that in a little bit more detail later on. We could also see how there are 4 stanzas that are made of 6 lines each. When there are 6 lines in a stanza, you can make note of how it's called a sestet. So I've written that here for you. And together with this, we also see how the stanzas follow a B, C, D, E, D pattern. So throughout the 4 stanzas, we see a B, C, D, E, D pattern. And what this is doing is essentially creating somewhat of a regularity. And in creating the sense of regularity, it allows us to be invested into each stanza at a time rather than being thrown off by the unpredictability of the form and structure of the poem. Another thing that you may want to keep in mind of is how the poem is a pastoral poem. And essentially, there is a lot of bucolic imagery throughout the poem. And what bucolic imagery is referring to is essentially imagery that is associated with the pleasant aspects of country life. So bucolic means referring essentially, we see how Dobson adopts an optimistic perception towards rural Australian landscape. And essentially, through doing that, she's trying to capture the symbiotic relationship that the two characters or humanity essentially shares with the natural world. The tonal shift from vitality, energy to one that is contemplative might also be something that you might want to keep in mind of. So from energy to reflective. Let's now move on to a stanza by stanza analysis. Now, in the first stanza, we start off the simile of his old fist like knotted branch. Here, it's adding to the imagery that captures the extremities of old age. And essentially, what that's referring to is this idea of how we get an image of tired old hands. The old fist here, it could serve as a synecdoche of the old man. So it's not the fist that's old, but the man is old. And this is in juxtaposition to the diction of punched. In he punched into his cap, that creates this idea of energy. It's a juxtaposition here because we don't usually associate old age and the act of punching and like the idea of energy together. What's interesting though is that the simple act of punching his cap is given deeper meaning. If you see here, we usually see, like here, we see direct quotation. But when we usually use direct quotation, it's usually to quote something that has been said by someone else. Here, there's no actual verbal communication, but the meaning that is implied in the old man's act is put in quotation marks, which suggests that though there's no actual communication that is taking place, there is a message that is being communicated just through gesture. And then we see the naturalistic imagery, the similes and the metaphors in this section. that add to the aforementioned pastoral theme of the poem. But maybe you could also consider the line here of the valley's bales are full. So here the word full, or like the diction of full, it's creating or it's serving symbolic of the abundance of the natural world. And here you might want to consider how the stanza is capturing the natural landscape under a more positive and optimistic light, as we have discussed previously in light of Dobson's adoption of bucolic imagery. So how this is adding to bucolic imagery is something that is worth noting. Now moving on to the second stanza. What we can recognize here is that the first and second stanza seem to be paralleling each other. So in the first stanza, the old man punched into his cap, and in the second stanza, we see how I, the persona, nods in agreement and likewise punched my hat. So there is a juxtaposition between his and I, and that's essentially adding to the parallelism. The young persona is essentially seemingly mimicking the old man, and that's somewhat capturing this idea of admiration. But it's not only her action that is being paralleled, but we also have the use of direct quotation here that follows the act of punching. And her act of punching also results in or also leads into something that is a lot more meaningful or a little bit more insightful. And what is interesting to note here is that the old man who's past his prime or like over the hill refers to morning in this section. And essentially morning is reflective or it represents the start of day, right? And that's essentially representing the idea of youth. And then we have the young persona in the next stanza refer to the other stages of noonday and night. And essentially that's going back to like the motif of time of day that's serving as a representation of the stages of human life. And what I want you to make note of here is that by reflecting or capturing the stages of human life, there is a sense of cyclicality that is being created. Wherein the wool being teased and spread in morning, the wind combing and spinning at noonday, and the night winding it in, it captures a cyclical nature of day that continues to repeat itself. Essentially, another thing that you might want to keep in mind of is the idea of night winding it in maybe captures this idea of clarity. Essentially, that is gained in the last stage of day, i.e., the last stage of the human life. So here, Dobson isn't necessarily painting a negative perception of the experience of aging in the human experience, and see how it kind of adopts the idea that we saw in her poem Over the Hill. So there are links to the idea of aging and the clarity that is gained through entering the last stage of the human life. And it's also interesting that we do have an allusion to Over the Hill in the third stanza as well. And in fact, we have this imagery of youth in the old man in the third stanza who's waving in careless joy. So the diction or like the imagery, it enhances his characterization of being energetic and also being quite youthful. So again, think about how the idea of old age and the idea of aging is painted by Dobson. But there is a little bit of difference in the third stanza as opposed to the first two, and we'll talk about that now. And the most obvious difference that we could kind of see, like just by looking at it, is that there's no direct quotation in the third stanza. And there's also no reference to the gesture of punching. However, what we can see is that there is a gesture that amounts to a deeper recognition of the fact that over the hills lay China. So essentially, though there is no direct quotation or there's no punching involved, we kind of see that there is a gesture of him waving his hand to the horizon that leads to the deeper recognition, or like the more insightful understanding of the world, that over the hills lie China. But when we are talking about China here, it's not China, but China is serving as a metonym of the broader world. So essentially, the persona is able to gain a wider understanding of the world through essentially observing the old man's careless joy. We also see how there is a transition from the juxtaposition of I and his that kind of pervaded the entirety of the poem, that changes to the inclusive language and both of us should go. So we have us here. Again, like if you see in the previous sections, it was like his, he, I. So there was kind of like a distinction between him and me, but now it's using inclusive language. So essentially what that's doing is it's creating a sense of union between the two characters, but you could also make note of how the word should here, it's conditional. So what's interesting here is that the conditional language of should go is in conflict with the high modal nature of the statement, in which the persona claims and both of us should go. So it's high modal, but it's conditional as well. They should go, but they haven't actually gone, so it might not actually manifest. Now, in the final stanza, we have the simile of being silent as two fence posts. So we recognize that they've engaged in such meaningful conversation, but through silence. And again, that's quite ironic or paradoxical. And then we also have the repetition of years, in this section, that is emphasizing how the poem is retrospective. So the persona is reflecting back upon the past. And we talked about this before in the previous slide, but remember how there is a transition in tone. So at the very beginning, we see this idea of vitality and energy, and how as we get down to the bottom of the poem, we see how the poem adopts more of a reflective or a little bit more of a contemplative tone. We also have the oxymoronic excellent old madman that works together with the alliterative W sound in wordless and wise. And that essentially comes down to this notion that wordless communication between the two individuals may be seen as talk as only children and fools may try, as in the previous section. But in actuality, true connection between the individuals, so like the madman and I, has actually been attained through silence. So that is the end of the analysis, and we move on now to the paragraph task. So the paragraph task is on what ideas on relationships does the poem The Conversation explore? Yes, the question is on relationships, but remember that a very big part of the poem is actually conversation, or more so the lack of conversation, and how it's able to impact relationships. So perhaps it will be a good idea for you to talk about the idea of how silence and how silent conversation that manifests in form of communication via gesture can be a very powerful source of communication between two individuals in the human experience. So that is the end of today's video, and I'll see you in the next video for Canberra morning.